Cape, and I intend to be a part of the crew to make the first return landing to the Cape in about a week. At this time, I'd like to introduce you or to perhaps the person you came to see, and that's Krista McAuliffe, our payload specialist, teacher in space.
Well, I am so excited to be here. We watched Columbia go over the Houston area this morning, and that was a thrill. I don't think any teacher has ever been more ready to have 2 lessons in my life. I've been preparing these since September, and I just hope everybody tunes in on day 4 now to watch the teacher teaching from space.
Mission 51L was designed to be extraordinary from the start. New Hampshire school teacher Krista McAuliffe had been handpicked by President Reagan from among 142 applicants to become America's first civilian in space.
The Teacher in Space program was a presidential initiative that originated in the 1984 presidential campaign and was in fact very closely followed by President Reagan. And Krista McAuliffe herself was designated the Teacher in Space at a White House ceremony that was presided over by the Vice President George Bush.
Her presence had sparked an excitement in spaceflight among a media and a public grown bored with the seemingly routine orbiter missions.
The White House was very interested in the Teacher in Space project as it proceeded through NASA, and as disclosed in the archives, there was time set aside during the Day 4 broadcast for the President to phone the shuttle and, as part of this nationwide program, to have a phone conversation with Krista McAuliffe and the other astronauts.
For a president who relied heavily on the power of television to establish his image as the great communicator, the timing couldn't have been more perfect. Reagan's annual State of the Union address was scheduled for Tuesday, January 28th, and a launch on or before that date would guarantee that McAuliffe's lesson from space would fall on a school day.
Good morning. This is Krista McAuliffe, live from the Challenger. And since I'm talking about why we're in space and why it's important that other people get a chance to fly in space.
Before McAuliffe could get that chance, however, she and her crewmates would have to wait even longer than anticipated. A combination of bad weather and technical glitches imposed additional delays, first to the 27th, then to the 28th. The reaction of the media was quick and predictable. Dan Rather on the CBS Evening News remarked, "Yet another costly, red faces all around space shuttle launch delay." ABC's World News Tonight taunted, "Once again, a flawless liftoff proved too much of a challenge for Challenger." Even as the launch was being postponed on Monday, another potential setback literally loomed on the horizon. A cold front was moving in, and the forecast called for freezing overnight lows. As the countdown to liftoff continued, the predicted temperature for launch the next morning was 29 degrees, far, far below any previous launch.
We had received word within Morton Thiokol that the expected overnight low was to be 18 degrees Fahrenheit. I personally found out about that about noontime, and a meeting was convened by Bob Ebling that had the members of the SEAL task force team present, plus some other engineers who were concerned with the problem. And we discussed the potentials of danger at launching at such a low temperature. And then we reconvened that meeting in the Vice President of Engineers office at Morton Thiokol and added some middle managers along with us. And those discussions went on, and everybody was in agreement that we should make an attempt to stop the launch at that point if that temperature materialized.
A telephone conference was convened on the afternoon of the 27th by NASA's Stanley Reinhardt to assess the possible effects of the cold.
All the preliminary discussions that took place that day were leading towards not flying under such adverse conditions, or at least postponing until conditions got better.
So after listening to the verbal presentation in the afternoon, they asked what Thiokol's position was, and I looked around the room, and I was a senior person, and I said, "I don't want to fly." Looks to me the story says that 53 degrees is about it. And of course, we were requested then to go back and do something more and prepare detailed charts and to show that in more detail.
Reinartz asks Thiokol to assemble its information and fax it to Kennedy and the Marshall Space Flight Center for a fuller evaluation in a three-way telephone conference call, or telecon, later that evening. His deputy, Judson Lovingood, recommends he notify higher-ups at Level 2 of the probable delay.
After completing that telecon and making the and everyone agreeing to meet at certain locations and have the subsequent telecon that evening, I called Stan at the motel, and I suggested to him that he go ahead and alert Arnie at that point.
Arnie being?
Arnie Aldridge, at that point, that we were having that meeting. We were going to get together within the center and decide what to do, and then prepare Arnie for getting Level 1 together and then going on up the line. But what I was looking at then was, I was thinking that there was a good possibility of a launch delay.
Good possibility of what?
Of a launch delay.
Aldrich is the next ranking official in the launch chain of command, operating out of the Level 2 Johnson Space Center in Houston, site of the astronauts' office. Reluctant to be the bearer of bad news, however, Reinartz ignores Lovingood's suggestion and decides to await the results of the evening telecon. The momentum for launch had begun. In the late afternoon, Reinartz returns to the Holiday Inn on Merritt Island and meets with the other Marshall Center managers to discuss the impending no-launch recommendation. Joining Reinartz at the motel are Larry Malloy, the project manager for solid rocket boosters at Marshall, James Kingsbury, the overall director of science and engineering, and William Lucas, the iron-willed controlling director of the Marshall Space Flight Center and Reinartz's direct superior. According to investigative reporter Malcolm McConnell's groundbreaking analysis of Challenger, one reliable NASA source, identified only as Apocalypse, revealed that Lucas staked his personal reputation on Marshall's performance. According to the source, Lucas had consistently made it clear to his managers that, quote, "Under no circumstances is Marshall to be the cause for delaying a launch," unquote.
This Marshall team was willing to work with a singleness of purpose and with a determination to complete whatever job was necessary to achieve a goal.
In the early evening hours of January 27th, here in one of these rooms, Lucas and his subordinates met to consider the implications of the Thiokol position.
I personally believe that at the motel room, some indication had to have been given by Lucas to Malloy that somebody had made a decision the launch was a go, and that your job was to see that it happened.
During the final telecon, Thiokol, as expected, would initially recommend against the launch, but ultimately reverse themselves under pressure from NASA. The decision-making process, according to the presidential investigation, was seriously flawed. That evening, as predicted, the temperatures dropped below freezing. The temperature at the joint was measured to be 8 degrees. It was not reported. Under the system, it was not required. The crew of the Challenger departed for the launch pad unaware of the discussions which took place the night before and oblivious to the dangers ahead. The temperature at 11:38 a.m. liftoff was 38 degrees, 15 degrees colder than any previous launch. At the precise moment of ignition, the rocket joints flex, and both O-rings, hopelessly compromised and hardened by the cold, separate from their sealing surface. They are vaporized as the hot gases burn through. Only a fragile seal, formed by the products of combustion, stops the leak and keeps Challenger from blowing up on the pad. The shuttle is on its final voyage. 60 seconds later, the fragile seal would shatter. Unbeknownst to flight controllers on the ground, the escaping gases burn away at the external fuel tank like a giant blowtorch. The fuel tank ruptures, breaking the orbiter into pieces. The crew compartment hurtles intact out of the vapor cloud its precious human cargo still on board. The 7 astronauts survive the breakup, but perish when their flight deck slams into the Atlantic nearly 3 minutes later. Most people, including the Presidential Commission investigating the resulting tragedy, still refer to it as the Challenger accident.
I can't characterize it as an accident at all. It's a disaster, a horrible, terrible disaster, but not an accident, because we could have stopped it. We had initially stopped it, and then that decision was made to go forward anyways.
That decision was made during the final telephone conference call, which began at 8:45 p.m. the night before the launch. The telecon that would seal Challenger's fate began at 8:45 p.m. on January 27th. For over 1 hour, Thiokol engineers, led by Roger Beaujolais, presented data suggesting that, because of the cold weather, the rubber O-rings would be harder than usual and therefore might not be capable of sealing the joint opening quickly enough.
And what that really means, basically, is that the harder the material is, it would be likened to trying to shove a brick into a crack versus a sponge. These are the sum and substance of what I just presented. If action time increases, then the threshold of secondary seal pressurization capability is approached. That was my fear. If the threshold is reached, then secondary seal may not be capable of being pressurized. And that was the bottom line of everything that had been presented up to that point. So from an erosion standpoint, I think it is fair to say that there was indeed sufficient margin. But that was not the issue. Erosion was not the issue. What was the issue is, can you stand a longer period of time in an attempt to seal before the erosion eats you alive and you don't have a seal period?
The Thiokol engineers were stating that they believe the effect of that lower temperature on the O-rings would be to slow the time for the primary O-ring to seal, resulting in greater hot gas past the primary seal and possibly erosion of the secondary seal. The data that they showed included the previous coldest launch, which was STS-51C, which they stated, at least qualitatively, had the worst blow-by of any previously observed. Considerable discussion between Marshall and Thiokol on the significance of those data then ensued. There was, at that time, we still didn't have conclusion and recommendation charts. All we were trying to do was understand what the data were telling us.
I was asked, at that point in time, I was asked to quantify my concerns. And I said I couldn't. I couldn't quantify it. I had no data to quantify it, but I did say I knew that it was away from goodness in the current database. Someone on the net commented that we had soot blow by on SRM-22, which was launched at 75 degrees. I don't remember who made the comment, but that's where the first comment came in about the disparity between my conclusion and the observed data, because SRM-22 had blow by at essentially a room temperature launch.
I guess one of the big things is that we really didn't know whether temperature was the driver or not. We couldn't tell. We had hot motors that blew by and cold motors that blew by, and some very near either end that did not. The data was inconclusive. So I had trouble justifying in my own mind and saying, by golly, temperature is a factor.
I was asked again for data to support my claim, and I said I have none other than what is being presented, and I had been trying to get resiliency data, Arnie and I both, since last October, and that statement was mentioned on the net. Others in the room presented their charts, and the main telecon session concluded with Bob Lund, who was our Vice President of Engineering, presenting his conclusions and recommendations charts, which were based on our data input up to that point.
And so we stood at the whiteboard there in the Management Information Center, and as the data would come in, we would try and say, now what does this tell us, what does this tell us, and put together a rationale for what we wanted to do. So it was in a real-time mode, and we were trying to absorb the data and put together the story. Well, as a result of that telecon, I gave the charts that made the recommendation that we wait until the motor got to 53 degrees. I didn't see anything different that I hadn't seen before. And, of course, you've heard the story of what happened after that.
Listeners on the telecon were not pleased with the conclusions and the recommendations.
What was the conclusion?
The conclusions were that we should not fly outside of our database, which was 53 degrees. Those were the conclusions. And we were quite pleased because we knew in advance, having participated in the preparation, what the conclusions were, and we felt very comfortable with that.
That was the very definite question of conservatism. You know, this program has people on it, so I'm very concerned about that. And I want to make sure that if there's any hint of a problem, that we're not extending that. We didn't have any data at that point that would indicate that we should go beyond that.
About halfway through, after we had looked at all the data, the conclusion and recommendation charts that Mr. Lund had prepared came in. And the logic for his recommendation, which did not specifically address don't launch 51L, what it said was that within our experience base, we should not operate any solid rocket motor at any temperature colder than we have previously operated one, which was 51C.
Well, didn't you take that to be a negative?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir. That was an engineering conclusion, which I found this conclusion without basis, and I challenged its logic.
Right after we stopped, our managers were asked for their launch decision. Joe Kilminster responded that he did not recommend launching based on the engineering presentation just made. That's the first no vote. Count them. Count them so you really understand what happened.
I asked Mr. Kilminster then, who is the Vice President of Space Booster Projects, for his recommendation for 51L. He stated that based on the engineering recommendation, he could not recommend launch. Now, I fully understood what Mr. Kilminster was saying at that time. He did not say the engineering data says that you can't launch. He says, I've got an engineering recommendation here, and based on that, I certainly cannot recommend launch. This was a rather surprising conclusion based on data that didn't seem to hang together. So I challenged that.
For the first time in the entire history of spaceflight, a contractor's recommendation not to launch was being challenged. It was clear to the Thiokol engineers that they were not telling NASA what it wanted to hear.
Larry Malloy then asked George Hardy at the Marshall Space Flight Center for his launch decision. George Hardy was like the chief engineer at the center. George responded that he was appalled by Thiokol's recommendation, but he would not recommend launching over the contractor's objection. That's the second no vote.
And so we got ourselves in the thought process that we were trying to find some way to prove to them it wouldn't work, and we were unable to do that. We couldn't prove absolutely that motor wouldn't work.
Thereafter, NASA, in one way or another, made it clear that they were displeased with that recommendation. And I assume that you knew when you made the recommendation that your recommendation, in fact, was going to determine whether that shuttle would be launched or not, because NASA had indicated to you they would not fly unless they had a written report from Thiokol saying you approved the launch.
I didn't know that NASA would accept that.
You didn't know that?
No, I didn't.
Well, you must have known your recommendation was very important. You knew that if you voted against the launch, it would not have been launched, didn't you?
Well, we had voted prior to it, and they didn't accept it, so I couldn't forecast what NASA would do.
No, but you knew that that was the reason they asked you to reconsider. That's why you had the 5-minute recess, didn't you?
That's a fair statement, yes.
Then Larry Malloy went into summary mode, and that's when he made his statements that started and actually reinforced the creation of pressure. George Hardy actually started the pressure when he said he was appalled. You have to understand George Hardy was a highly respected manager and engineer in the program and worked for many, many years. And when George Hardy says he's appalled, people sit up straight in the chair and take notice. And that was the beginning of the pressure. Larry Malloy just escalated the pressure with comments like, "My God, Thiokol, when do you want me to launch, next April? Or why are you guys trying to come up with launch commit criteria on the eve of the launch?"
The total context, I think, in which those words may have been used is, there are currently no launch commit criteria for joint temperature. What you are proposing to do is to generate a new launch commit criteria on the eve of a launch after we have successfully flown with the existing launch commit criteria 24 previous times. With this LCC, i.e. do not launch with a temperature greater than 53 degrees, we may not be able to launch until next April. We need to consider this carefully before we jump to any such conclusions. It's all in context, again, with challenging, I think, your interpretation of the data. What does it mean, and is it logical? Is it truly logical that we really have a system that has to be 53 degrees to fly? Now, that has been interpreted by some people as applying pressure. I certainly don't consider it to be applying pressure. Anytime that one of my contractors, or for that matter, some of Mr. Hardy's people, who come to me with a recommendation and a conclusion that is based on engineering data, I probe the basis for their conclusion to assure that it is sound and that it is logical. I found this recommendation not to launch an SRM at a temperature below 53 degrees it came as somewhat of a surprise to me.
One of my colleagues that was in the meeting summed it up best. This was a meeting where the determination was to launch, and it was up to us to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was not safe to do so. This is in total reverse to what the position usually is in a pre-flight conversation or flight readiness review. It's usually exactly opposite that.
I assure you, sir, that there was no reversal of the tradition of NASA, which says prove to me why you can't fly versus prove to me why you can.
We've dealt with Marshall for a long time, and I've always been in the position of defending our position to make sure that we were ready to fly. And I guess I didn't realize until after that meeting and after several days that we had absolutely changed in a position from what we had been before. But that evening, it was, I guess I had never had those kinds of things come from the people at Marshall, that we had to prove to them that we weren't